Welcome back to this next lecture in your leadership module. Today we're going to be talking about consensus building. And this is one of those ideas or activities that are aligned with what we do in interpersonal development, right? How to negotiate with people, how to make sure that things work together. So our session objectives for this one are to discuss the possible advantages and challenges of using consensus. We are going to give you a framework with 8 steps on how to make consensus, and then you're going to implement it in an exercise. So to begin, what is consensus? Take some time with yourselves and discuss what this could be. Come back in about 5 minutes. Hopefully you will have gotten to a definition that looks something like this. Consensus is maximum agreement among people while drawing on as much of everyone's ideas as possible. So basically, consensus building is coming together to brainstorm and have an ideas on a specific problem and come together to a solution that is of best interest for all of us, right? Now, what are the advantages and challenges of using consensus to make decisions? Take 5 minutes in pairs, discuss, and then we'll come back. So, depending on what you came up with, let's see if it's added into what we're going to consider here of why it is important, right? Why is consensus important? Or when should you use consensus? 1, if there's no clear line management authority, so there's no direct head of command that will be telling you which way to do things, then consensus is important because the whole team needs to get involved in this decision-making process. It's important also because it facilitates, as I've mentioned, inclusive processes, so it gets everyone involved and makes everyone feel part of it, which leads to buy-in. Buy-in is when you have people who are willing to support the idea that has come out of consensus or that is being discussed in consensus. And it allows for creative solutions because you're picking from different people's brains, right? So you're going to have a broader pool of ideas of what can happen. Now, why do you think consensus is important? Discuss for another 5 minutes and then come back. What else did you add? I'm curious to know. Well, moving forward, as important as it is, when not to use consensus building. And here is a simple list that shows you when consensus building might not be the right approach for decision making. When there are other methods that are more effective, when the solutions are obvious, if standards would be compromised, if there are extreme views, particularly because these can put consensus, the process of it, into a stalemate. How to deal with very extreme views is something that we'll talk about in the negotiation lecture, and we'll talk about briefly how to approach these kinds of situations. If time is limited, of course, because consensus building requires a lot more time than just taking a directive decision. And, as we've discussed previously, trust is crucial. If you do not have sufficient trust within a team, consensus is going to be very difficult. So, based on what we've discussed so far, what are some of the key skills that you need to facilitate consensus building? That is, if you're in the role of the facilitator, the person leading the process of consensus, what do you think are some of the skills you will need? And here's a hint. They're surely going to have to do with leadership. Take 2 to 5 minutes to discuss and then come back. So, depending on what skills you came up with, let's look at the list. You will see that some of these are quite obvious, but I want to highlight a couple that are key. Limit your own ideas. Now, this is particular to the role of a facilitator. If you're facilitating consensus, your job is to make sure that you draw out ideas of as many people as you can. However, by nature of being the facilitator, you tend to seem to the participants like you're on a higher level, on a higher command level of the situation. And so your ideas might be perceived in an imbalanced way. So if you're facilitating a process, try to limit your own ideas as much as possible. Your goal, again, is to bring out the ideas of others. And in doing so, as the next point says, to link them, to bring them together. Checking understanding. A lot of the time in consensus processes, we don't dig deep enough into what the precise or minute details are. And in order to do that, it's important for you as a facilitator to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And one way to do this is the next point, to summarize regularly. After each main idea block or point that you've discussed, make sure you summarize it and get everyone's agreement that this is what has been said and understood. And obviously the last one is balanced contribution. Sometimes you will find in some groups that there's some very outspoken individuals and some that are not as outspoken. But there might lie some of the best ideas or best solutions that you can have. So as a facilitator, don't be scared to take the role on of making some people a little less participative and some to speak up a little more. Okay? Well, what can we say about the actual process of building consensus? As you see here, the key is that it needs to be systematic. You can't go about it in a happy-go-lucky way. You can't expect it to happen by magic. There has to be a system in your consensus building process to ensure that it's effective. Here are some of the other points that are key for a consensus building project. Take a look, and then we'll move on into how to actually do it. So, here are 8 steps for building consensus. This is one of the frameworks that can be used for you, by you and for your activities, again in your leadership toolkit, to build consensus. So I'm going to run quickly through them, and then, of course, you'll get to practice them. So, the first one is agree on your objectives. And by this, it means what are you trying to get out of this consensus building session? Not necessarily what great problems you're dealing with or what processes you're trying to improve. This is agree on what the meeting is about. What are the expectations and what are the rules? Be clear about then defining the problem or decision that needs to be done. This is to ensure that you can keep the rest of the process aligned. You brainstorm with the people around, you narrow the list, you discuss pros and cons, and then you adjust, compromise, and fine-tune. What this means is to take what has been discussed and find the best fitting solution within the team, through the team, right? Then you have to make your decision and finally act upon what you decide. That 8th step, although it seems intuitive, is crucial. If you go through this whole consensus building process, you take a decision and then you don't implement it, the morale, the belief, the trust that the team has in your capability or the team's capability of carrying this out will be diminished. So if you manage to agree on something through your consensus building project, make sure you follow through. Having said that, it's time to go back in the water. So, you're going to be split into groups of 5, and you're going to work with a scenario that has to do with a WASH cluster. Now, some of you might not be familiar with what the WASH cluster is, so very briefly. During the humanitarian reform in 2005, when it was realized that emergencies, the responses to emergencies, were becoming too complex because there were too many actors involved, the UN system, along with other international NGO partners, came up with the cluster. So the cluster means that there is one agency, one UN agency that acts as the coordinator on the field in emergencies, usually in liaison with a government counterpart or a non-governmental counterpart. The WASH cluster is what these meetings are called. So in a WASH cluster, you usually have all the organizations that participate, are active, or are in some way influential in the WASH sector in a particular country. UNICEF acting as the coordinating lead, and then a government or another selected non-government official as their coordinator. Having said that, here's your role. Your lecturer will give you a role within that group. You will act that role in response to a flood and what kind of a response you need to do to that flood. And the way that this has been structured is that the mayor of your city has asked you to come up with 3 indicators that are SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And these indicators will then be presented to donor organizations for funding. You have 25 minutes. Your lecturer will give you your roles, read them, and begin the negotiations because time is short. Try and follow this consensus building process and see how far you get. Good luck, and when you're done, come back for the wrap-up. Did you manage to get 3 indicators? Most of the times I've run this exercise with participants, they do not even get close to a single indicator. They get stuck somewhere between step 5 or 6 of the consensus building process. And that's okay. The objective again here is for you to begin to practice and get familiar with what this 8-step framework is so that you can use it and draw on it when you need. To reflect on how the process went, take some time to answer these 3 questions and see what you found in your consensus building exercise. When you're done, come back. So I hope this reflection moment was useful for you as well. Remember, reflection can help our self-awareness, which helps us develop as leaders, right? So it's important to take these moments of debrief or reflection quite seriously. Now, these are the key takeaway points for this consensus building lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look very much to seeing you in the next one. Thank you.